All right, so let's get started. Welcome to the big 800th EPAASM monthly meeting. Today we have Dr. Esther Babedi to give us a lecture on fungal infections. So, 800. This is put together by our archives, Linda Miller. So we didn't have a record of the 100th meeting, but the earliest record we have was 118, and that was in 1936. And the next one is my kind of favorite because it's on flu virus and pneumococci. And so, as you can see, 362, 400 in 1977. That was also a fungi talk. 500th, also fungal. Somehow, fungal talk is really enriched in our 100th meetings. 600 was our Helicobacter pylori by Dr. Blaser, and lastly, our very own Garth Ehrlich, and 700 in 2009. And so luckily we have 800 talk by Dr. Babedi talking about fungal, make the theme continue, right? So ASM, like NPR, we need your support. ASM is basically providing a community for microbiologists and immunologists, so you can advance your science, your career, nurture this network and your community. ASM Connect has been pretty active. You can go on there and then join the conversation. You can start a conversation, communicating with your colleagues across the globe. And EPAASM, of course, we wouldn't be here without our membership support, our very active student chapters, as well as our education committee and our executive committee. Other than the monthly meeting, we also have our annual symposium, clinical microbiology symposium every year. We also have our Philadelphia Infection and Immunity Forum. And lastly, from the education committee, we have our outreach as well as the education program. So I mentioned the Peggy Carter Travel Awards to ASM Microbes, and we have 3 awardees this year. We have James from Kyle's lab as a clinical technologist. We have Courtney and Nicole from Laura Glaser's labs, and so we congratulate them for getting that Peggy Carter Travel Award. Thanks. Hi, Earth. And so please renew your membership or join your ASM and as well as EPAASM. You can go to our website at epaasm.org, and there's a little button to join today. For postdoc and faculty, it can be between 50, 100 to 200, depending on your funding. And for postdoc, and faculty, for the membership of the branch is $20 per year. For the students, it's free for EPAASM. You can join it. Please do, because our membership dips every year at the beginning because your membership runs out, and so you have to renew it every year. And for the if you do decide to join the ASM National Students, it's only $35. But go to our website. You can click that button. You can decide to join National, the branch, or both. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but so some of the upcoming events. So we have in March, we have David Olson from Merck. In April, we have Kim Orth, and that from UT Southwestern. In the May meeting, we have a student chapter organized meeting with the students talk as well as the keynote speakers. And then in June meeting, we have a Norman Willett education meeting. And so for the Zoom world, click the button in the participant. You can raise your hands to ask questions at the end, or you can type the question in chat. And Kyle will introduce our speaker.
soldier was injured on the job over the weekend. His friends, his colleagues, and obviously his family are feeling very fortunate that he survived.
We saw him when we put our hand up and took a vow to do this job.
But that all-important job of a firefighter comes with inherent risk and danger.
Thanks everybody for joining. I'm really happy everyone made it out on a not so pleasant evening. Tonight we have the pleasure of having Dr. Esther Babadi here. She is a board certified clinical microbiologist with expertise in molecular laboratory diagnosis of infectious diseases. She received her doctoral degree in biochemistry and molecular biology and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in clinical microbiology, both at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. She is currently the chief of clinical microbiology service, an attending microbiologist and professor in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine and the Department of Medicine Infectious Disease Service at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. At a national level, she serves on several professional societies committees, including those of the American Society for Microbiology, the Pan American Society for Clinical Virology, where she is currently the acting president, and the Association for Molecular Pathology. Her research focus is on the rapid diagnosis of infectious diseases using molecular-based methods and the application of molecular methods for the surveillance and prevention of healthcare-acquired infections, primarily in immunocompromised cancer patients. Dr. Babadi has published extensively on diagnostic molecular microbiology tests. She's a senior editor of the journal Microbiology Spectrum, and also serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Clinical Virology, the Journal of Molecular, and the Journal of Molecular Diagnostics. She is an elected fellow of the Infectious Diseases Society of America and the American Academy of Microbiology. Related to today's lecture, she is the co-chair of the Fungal Diagnostics Laboratory Consortium, a group that is focused on the development and evaluation of new diagnostic methods for fungal diseases, new ways to ID and detect these pathogens, and collaborating on antifungal resistance detection and new drug development. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Esther Babadi.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? All right. Well, starting with just thank you again for the invitation to speak today on what is one of my favorite topics in clinical microbiology, which is fungal diagnostics. So my goal today is to tell you a little bit of why it is one of my favorite subjects, but also some of the challenges that we deal with this particular set of organisms. I thought it was really interesting that all your hundreds of lectures focused on fungi, because I like to think of them as neglected, but the fact that you have so many lectures on fungi actually makes me feel really good. So those are some of my financial disclosure, but they won't really have any impact on today's lecture, which this is going to be a bit hard. I'm just going to look here. The objective for today are to really discuss all of the different patient populations that are at risk for fungal infection, and in particular, invasive fungal infection. I want to describe the challenges that are associated with making those diagnoses, and also discuss the goals of the Fungal Diagnostic Laboratory Consortium. So Kyle alluded a little bit about the consortium. In the last 10 minutes or so of the talk, I will tell you about that consortium, how it came about, and what our goals are. So the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, so all of my interest, my research interest has always been in diagnosing infection in immunocompromised hosts, and it's by design, just because I work at a cancer hospital. For those who don't know, Sloan Kettering is on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and it's a tertiary care cancer center, as the name suggests. Something that you may not always be aware of is the fact that Sloan Kettering, in addition to caring for cancer patients, I always like to tell how we also care for patients with other immune deficiencies. And that would be sickle cell anemia, beta thalassemia, so those kind of things. These patients also present to Sloan Kettering for care. The size of the hospital, maybe mid-size, 480 beds. We do about 25,000 admissions per year and 450 hematopoietic stem cell transplant. And as far as the size of the hospital in terms of employee, again, relatively large at 22,000 employees. When I first started at Sloan Kettering over 10 years ago, we were half that number. So the hospital has really increased in size, and the complexity of patients that we see keeps increasing. So what we want to do today is talk about fungal infections. I was really glad that I got time before the talk to chat with a few people to just get a sense of who's in the audience. My initial assumption was that it was all clinical microbiologists, but I hear that there's some basic scientists and those who don't actually talk about or think about fungi very much. So I thought these slides would maybe just give an overview. The kingdom fungi, I think it's fascinating. And when I teach the clinical microfellow, this part of microbiology is always interesting because you have to learn a completely new language. It's like Latin, right? Like I think you can say that of all of micro, but with fungi, there is so much variety in the different class, the different order, and the different genera. Here, I'm just giving you a sense of what those would be. So for example, some of the things that we worry a lot for invasive fungal infection would be things like the mucorales. So rhizopus is a good example of that. But Cryptococcus, even if you're not really caring for patients with cancer, Cryptococcus is another organism that in the HIV patient population, we tend to worry much about. Having to understand where the fungi lies in this phylogenetic trees is also very important for the way we report them. And this has become a little bit of a point of contention of how do we even name this? Because fungi are eukaryotic, we have multiple forms of the same organism, and sometimes that creates some challenges even in the way that we recognize the same organism in different form, right? So talking about the sexual versus the asexual stage of what we detect in the laboratory and what's detected in a patient when they get a biopsy, for example. So speaking of the names, one of the things that has been happening a lot in the last several years is that the name of these organisms keep changing. And part of the reason for that is that now, if I just go back one slide here, on this side, I'm showing you images of what these organisms look like, and they have different shape, different morphology. And this is really how they used to be classified based on what they look like in the laboratory on an agar plate or under the microscope. But as molecular method developed, it became a little bit more clear that some of the classification of these different organisms was not necessarily the most correct. And over time, as more information and more sequencing is happening, the classification of the organism is changing, and new names are being not developed, but they've been classified differently. That would be all fine if we were just in a basic research lab doing taxonomic information. But from a clinical lab perspective, where the name of an organism is so deeply associated with a syndrome, those changes actually create some problem. And because of that, the Journal of Clinical Microbiology every so often publishes in name changes for fungi or bacteria or viruses and so on. And in this document, and the last one was published in 2021, they highlight some of the changes so that clinical microbiologists can be aware of these changes and communicate them to their clinician. So that's actually one of the big challenges I think that we deal with fungi. What's in a name? I like this quote, that which we call a rose by any other word will smell as sweet, right? When you know the name of something, you associate it with a particular, and here will be a smell, but a particular disease, a particular syndrome. And so it's quite important that as we identify this organism in the laboratory, we communicate that information as far as what they actually represent. And as I alluded to a little bit earlier, with fungi may be different from bacteria because they have either a sexual and asexual stage. They can have two different names depending on which one of the stages was actually identified first. And in order to really circumvent this and all of the complication that is created in 2023, the International Code for Nomenclature for algae, fungi, and plant basically stated that we will no longer permit the use of a dual naming system for fungi. So we're going to pick one stage, and that's the one that's going to be used, and not going back and forth, naming the same organism to different things. So challenge number one is just nomenclature of fungi and understanding what it is that we are reporting to our clinician. But when we take a step back and think about, is this really a problem? Why do I love fungi? Well, yes. And the challenge with it, though, is that because we don't have the best diagnostic method, it's not always very clear the extent of the infections that are out there. However, in 2022, I think this review did a really good job looking at ICD-10 codes, so the way patients are coded for their disease in the hospital. That code to really look at how many patients out there were really suffering from fungal infection. And so they looked at the prevalence, and this is the burden and the healthcare burden of fungal infection in the United States in 2018. And this was published last year. So overall, 13 million infection and 1.5 million deaths globally can be attributed to fungal infection. Out of those, 35.5 million hospitalization. And when you think in terms of dollar, 1.4 billion when the primary reason for the hospitalization was fungi, and $37.7 billion when you think of any other code in which fungi was also identified. So the patient could have been in the hospital for diabetes, and then they had fungal infection. So in immunocompromised patients, we know that this is a significant issue. And as good as some of our cancer treatment have become, one of the things that still remains a problem is that many of these patients may survive the cancer, but then they get, they experience a significant level of morbidity from this type of infection. And we'll discuss a little bit more about that. In addition to cancer patients, we have other patients with chronic disease like asthma and cystic fibrosis that also experience fungal infection. And then, as mentioned a little bit earlier, we think about fungal infection as neglected disease. And because of that, there's a lack of awareness and research funding. Just to give you an example, viral infection, we do not do most laboratories do not do viral culture anymore, right? Because there's enough diagnostic tool out there that are available for virus. So HIV, Hep C, CMV, you name it, there's probably a test that's available. And even more so, many of those tests are actually FDA approved. When you think about fungi, that story changes significantly and things get a little bit more complicated. I want to say part of the reason for that is that with fungi, the range of infection varies so much that sometimes we don't think about them as being necessarily that serious, right? So you have different syndromes like superficial infection, localized infection, invasive, which is the one that we worry the most. And then we have some endemic mycosis that are also significant in terms of the impact on patient care. Here, just giving an example, right? If you tell someone that you want to invest a lot of money in diagnosis, athlete's foot, they'll be like, but who cares, right? Just make sure that you don't wear wet socks or wet shoes, whatever, right? But if I tell you about mucormycosis and in a diabetic patient that it can result in really bad infection to the point that you have to have, not just a biopsy, but really like scraping of the infection, that becomes a different situation. So how do we reconcile the fact that some of these fungi causes nuisance, right? And some of them like mucor, like histoplasma infection that are really serious and need to be managed accordingly. In that review that I just mentioned, that was published recently, the author makes a really good point of highlighting not just the type of infection, but the type of patient that are increased risk for fungal infection. I stand here and I've already told you about cancer patient. And when you look at this table, cancer as a group, over 2 million cases per year. In addition to cancer patients, the other group that was really high was some of these other chronic infection like asthma. COPD, also very, very high in terms of being at increased risk for fungal infection and diabetes, right? So it's a syndrome of an infection that affects quite a big number of patients. And we need to be really thinking about this and really caring for this patient by developing better treatment, better diagnosis. There we go. So most recently, finally, we're getting a little bit more attention focused on fungi. Last year, the WHO actually published the very first fungal priority pathogen list. I think most of you may have heard about the antibiotic resistance and like the list for these particular organisms and how we need to fight antimicrobial resistance. And mostly, again, bacteria has always been the focus. We just, I want to say, came out of a pandemic. We are still in the pandemic. It hasn't been declared over, but viruses, which is my second favorite, no, my first favorite, not my second favorite, are viruses, right? We still deal with them, and everyone can think about Ebola, they can think about COVID, but a fungal list, this was new and got a lot of us very excited. So when you look at this, the list was broken down into 3 groups. We have the critical group. We need to be finding solution yesterday. And so that group includes Cryptococcus, Aspergillus fumigatus, Candida auris, right? Like I think in terms of antimicrobial resistance, that particular yeast is one that makes everyone really nervous because it's so resistant. Aspergillus fumigatus, I've been focusing a lot on mucor every time I mention cancer patient. But Aspergillus is another one that you really worry about. It seems a little bit silly to think about a mold that would grow on your bread at home and you don't worry about it. But in a cancer patient, diabetic patient, that organism becomes very problematic. And then Candida albicans being another yeast that's on that list. Then we have the high group and the medium group. But essentially, all of these organisms are now have a light shine upon them so that we can do something about it. We can ask for more money. We can ask for more resources to be able to deal with that and develop new tests and develop new methods. Tom Schiller is the, what is his title again? The chief of the mycotic disease branch for the CDC. And last year in National Geographic, in one of the National Geographic article, he was really quoted talking about the fact that humans are not prepared for a pandemic that would be caused by fungal infections. We think about pandemic and it's been viruses, viruses, and viruses. What if it was a fungal organism? How would we deal with that? All right, so, as we think about fungal infection, Candida auris is one that when it first popped up in 2009, we worried a lot about it, and now there's been less talk about this. But we don't have tools for diagnosing this infection, not as readily as we have them for, again, viruses and bacteria. Not sure if this looks familiar to any of you. I'm hearing smile and laughter. So in terms of again, highlighting the importance of this, we'll take whatever we can. If Hollywood comes and helps us raise the attention on fungi, more power to them, right? So this is a scene from the HBO series, The Last of Us. I don't like zombie movie. Like my husband has been watching The Walking Dead for years. I cannot deal with that. But last week or 2 weeks ago, one of my fellow comes and she said, you need to be watching this. It's about killer fungi or something along those lines. So I just told you how Tom Schiller had to talk about would the pandemic be caused by fungi. Well, he had another interview with this UK magazine, The Independent, where they wanted to get his opinion on if what's happening in The Last of Us could actually happen. And so Tom Shields goes by saying, you know, we may not need to worry about turning into zombies, but we do need to think fungus. And I feel like, again, any opportunity to highlight the fact that we don't think enough about fungus, that we don't invest enough about fungus, we need to take it and go from there. So one day maybe I'll watch that series, but right now I'm just going to take advantage that everybody thinks fungus for a little while. All right. So I already alluded to a couple of issues. We don't have a really good, I mean, we have challenges with just naming these organisms. We don't have very good tools. But instead of just taking my word for it, I'm going to give you a couple of cases to highlight this. We could actually have the entire symposium to just discuss diagnostic challenges in fungal infection. But because I know that this is 6 p.m., it's the end of the day, I'm going to focus on one of my favorite organisms. And we'll use that as an example to highlight the different types of challenges that we have. All right, so I have two cases. The very first case is that of a 76-year-old male. He was diagnosed with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, and he was on his chemotherapy, rituximab, and this was his third cycle. On imaging, that's his PET-CT, he had what was basically defined as ground glass opacity on the upper left lobe, as well as severe bilateral pneumonia and pneumonitis. So the question from the clinicians when they were thinking about what this patient could be suffering from was that, is it drug-induced or is it infectious? Pretty much, you know, usually like the two options. So from a clinical microbiology standpoint, they essentially threw the kitchen sink at this patient. And this happens in our patient population a lot. They have very complicated cases where we order hundreds and hundreds of tests on them, not hundred, several tests on them. So patient had a blood culture, Legionella urine antigen done, histoplasma, first fungi there, Streptococcus, Mycoplasma chlamydia pneumoniae, MRSA, VRE, C. diff PCR, EBV. All of those were negative. Did a galactomannan, one of the few fungal biomarker that we have, that was negative. Did a bacterial fungal culture for the BAL and the bronch washing, which were collected when they saw the ground glass opacity. Mycobacterial culture, viral culture. So this case is a little bit old. That's why we still have viral culture there. And then an ovine parasite exam. And as you can see, everything was negative. We did a pneumocystis DFA, and that was negative. And then we did a serum beta-D-glucan. So for beta-D-glucan, so I'm saying these words, and some of you may be familiar with those and some may not, but the serum beta-D-glucan is another fungal biomarker. So in this case, the serum beta-D-glucan was 230 picogram per ml, and the cutoff for something to be positive by beta-D-glucan is 80 picogram per ml. So now we have a case where everything is negative, every single test except the serum beta-D-glucan. Okay, so probably a fungal infection, but which one? So I get this email, and this, like, again, this was a few years ago, several years ago, where one of my colleagues sent me an email. She said, okay, Esther, you know, can we perform, or can we please request a PCP PCR on one of your new fancy machines? The patient had a bronch on this date. It'll be very helpful and will help us like figure out what's going on. So what is happening here? Like I said, this was several years ago, but this hasn't really changed. We were developing a laboratory-developed test for pneumocystis PCR, and pneumocystis being one of the fungal organisms on that list that WHO had. But there wasn't really a FDA clear commercial test that we could have our hands on. So this was during the development phase of the assay. And because, I don't know if you see the name there, I had the name because the person who reached out to me was one of my colleague in infectious disease. She knew that we were developing this test. And so she's like, can we take a look and see if this patient would be positive? So you took a look. But before we show you these results, I wanted to go to case number 2. So with case number 2, this is a 24-year-old female, also leukemia patient, and she was 7 months post hematopoietic stem cell transplant. Overall, she was feeling really well, but she was tired. She was positive for mucor before her transplant. So she had already had a very severe fungal infection. And so she was treated with posaconazole. She was on pentamidine for pneumocystis prophylaxis. On imaging, she had the same sort of ground glass opacity, but this was new from her pre-transplant issues. So the whole issue here was trying to rule out what was the reason for her pneumonia. So similar to case number 1, they ordered blood culture, Leishman urine antigen, CMV PCR, EBV PCR. They did the galactomannan, and here they did both the serum and the bronchial washing and the BAL. Beta-D-glucan, this fungal marker I just mentioned, was negative. The galactomannan, which is also a fungal marker, was negative. Bacterial fungal culture, everything's negative. Mycobacterial culture, viral culture, and the ovine parasite, everything's negative. They do the pneumocystis DFA, and so in this particular case, the DFA was positive. And what does the DFA does? This direct fluorescence antibody. You take a sample, you put on a slide, you add some antibody to pneumocystis antigen, you look under the microscope. If it's greenish, you say it's positive. If there's no green, you say it's negative. So it's a subjective thing that you look under the microscope, and it does require a lot of experience for the text to interpret that. So pneumocystis DFA was positive. So we have a diagnosis. Well, no, I get a call, sort of the opposite call from a clinician saying, are you sure? This doesn't make any sense, which then brings us back to, so why did you order this test? But here and there, we don't say that to them. No dyspnea, no apoxia, no fever. And then her beta-D-glucan was negative. Her LDH was normal, and cytology. So this is another laboratory in the department that looks also at respiratory sample. In the cytology lab, they did not see any sort of form under the microscope that would look like pneumocystis, right? So we have 2 cases with all of these results, but we need to figure out what's going on. So what are the diagnostic options for fungal organism? Well, I sort of alluded to a few of them, right? So culture, I guess culture at this point still remains the gold standard. We have beta-D-glucan, which is an antigen that's found on the surface of these organisms. Galactomannan, it's a little bit more specific for the aspergillus. We mentioned a little bit about the aspergillus. Cryptococcal antigen, so Cryptococcus neoformans is one of the organisms on the WHO list, but it has its own antigen. We can do some biochemical. Mass spectrometry is now really what we focus on. Nucleic acid amplification testing, like that fancy machine PCR that my colleague was asking about, and sequencing. So with fungal culture, we have a whole bunch of different media that we can do this. The problem is that depending on the organism, they can grow either really quickly, 24, 48 hours, or they can take a long time. In our laboratory, we keep fungal culture for up to 28 days in order to make sure we can recover like the slow growers. And then there is some temperature dependence depending again on the organism. We don't really do biochemical very much anymore because we are like a fancy lab now and we all do multi-tough mass spectrometry. But back in the days, you know, there were a few things that we did, like cornmeal agar. I still remember trying to interpret a cornmeal agar where you have an agar, you cut it down, you put the organism, you have a slide, and you try to see the way the organism grow and I would tell you this is Candida albicans versus Cosia. Call it magic, but people could really do the interpretation for that. And then you have some special media like birdseed agar, where you can grow some of the crypto, and depending on the color, that's how you made the diagnosis. So those were based on biochemical. The cryptococcal antigen is really good, but it's actually one of the biggest success story for fungal diagnostic is the cryptococcal antigen. But again, very specific for just one organism. The galactomannan, primarily used for diagnosis of Aspergillus species. Performance vary by patient population, so that's a little bit of a challenge. And then there is this part of sort of a known issue with a lot of the antigen is that while it's the Aspergillus galactomannan, it can cross-react with members of other fungi, so like Penicillium alternae, Paecilomyces, and so on. So it's not super specific just for Aspergillus. Then you have the beta-D-glucan, and I talked a little bit about the beta-D-glucan in both our cases. So this is a cell wall antigen. It's not super specific for, again, a specific fungi because it can be found in a lot of other organisms. Even some bacteria may have a different shape of the beta-D-glucan, but it's a good marker for pneumocystis jirovecii. And so that's why part of the reason when we look at beta-D-glucan, we think pneumocystis. It's a bit labor intensive. I'm going to take a step back here. It's not just labor intensive, and there's a new version of the assay on the market now that I hope is going to solve this, but it's a test that is so susceptible to your environment that you have to have a separate clean room just to perform that testing. I was at the Mayo Clinic last summer for a visit, and they showed me the sort of clean room where they just do beta-D-glucan. And I'm sure, Kyle, you remember that room if it was there at the time, right? So not every lab can just have a separate room for one single test. So that's not very convenient. The issue with the beta-D-glucan is that it can cross-react with a lot of things. The fact that it's positive doesn't tell you if it's Candida, if it's pneumocystis, and so on. Then we have mass spectrometry. So most laboratories have switched to MALDI-TOF. We use the Vitek MS at Sloan, and that particular platform has a very good mold database. But in order to use the MALDI-TOF, you need an organism already growing on an agar plate, right? I cannot take a clinical sample and then run it on the molding. So it has some limitation there. Then there's a few Candida PCR tests. Mostly they are part of either a lab developed test or they're part of like a blood culture NAT panel is where many of our candidate assays are. When you think about the FDA cleared, approved, I mentioned that there aren't many. And if you look at the list, what is it? It's primarily Candida. And Candida, again, part of a multiplex panel that tend to be something that is the sample comes into the lab, it grows in culture, then you do PCR on it, right? So that's a little bit limiting. And there are maybe one test, the T2 Candida panel, that is directly from a blood culture, but the performance of that test in real lab hasn't been like the most successful. Outside of the US, they do a much better job. They have a whole bunch of PCR looking for Aspergillus, pneumocystis, Mucorales, Candida, and so on. So this is sort of a goal for us in the US. Can we get commercial vendor to develop all of these different tests? So that was really the options that we had. So if we go back to the cases, the fancy test that my colleague was asking was really a real-time PCR for pneumocystis, right? And this was a test that we were developing at Sloan Kettering at the time, and it was based on an assay that had been published at the Mayo Clinic several years before that. So that was 2006, this is to 2023. There still isn't a commercial test for pneumocystic based on PCR. The way we validated this test, we compared the PCR we were developing to the direct fluorescent assay. And you'll see, I mentioned what the DFA was. So this is what you were looking under the microscope for this little green kidney bean shaped structure, as opposed to a PCR and a MELD curve where you're basically amplifying is completely objective there. If you look at this 2x2 table, I actually panicked when we realized how many times we were really missing pneumocystis, because those were samples that had been tested by the DFA. There was 25 cases where DFA was not detected, but PCR was positive, and only 5 cases where they were both positive. So this test was really missing a lot of cases of pneumocystis. So when you look at the case number 1, the DFA was negative, the beta-D-glucan was positive, and the PCR was positive. So we concluded that this was a case of pneumocystis pneumonia. In the second case, DFA was positive, but the beta-D-glucan was negative, which is why the clinicians asked what's going on. And when we did the PCR in that case, that was also a negative result. So we concluded here that this was not pneumocystis, and probably the green thing that had been seen under the DFA was just false, not false positive, but they were not specific for pneumocystis. But why am I telling you about both beta-glucan and pneumocystis in order to make that diagnosis? And that comes again in terms of some of the challenges. PCP, PCR in general, very sensitive test. However, as I showed you, it picked up so many cases that were missed by the DFA. Does it mean that we had all of these patients at Sloan that were suffering from pneumocystis and we did not diagnose them? Yes and no, because part of the challenge with PCR is that you cannot distinguish between colonization, so being just infected with an organism without having disease caused by it, and actual problem. And the beta-D-glucan, because it's an antigen, you're going to assume that this is something that represents an actively replicating organism. We're making assumption here, but that's the general idea. So a few years back, one of my colleagues and I, we met and we're like, we should really look at this problem a little bit closer. Can we combine the fact that the beta-D-glucan is not really specific just for pneumocystis, but maybe a better marker of active infection, with the fact that PCR is so sensitive that maybe we can combine those two methods to really have a way of better diagnosing our patient. So we looked at the clinical performance of the beta-D-glucan for the diagnosis of pneumocystis pneumonia in patients who tested positive by PCR. So another issue with fungal infection that makes it very challenging is shown in this table, right? How do we define fungal disease? We have a definite, we have probable, we have possible, and then we have not disease. I mean, I guess you could argue if same thing happens with COVID, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But it's very unique to fungal infection that just to define if a patient has an infection or not, there's different category. And they have guidelines and review written about this pretty much every maybe 10 years to like what constitutes a definite fungal infection versus a probable versus a possible. And then for the purpose of this paper, we had different criteria to define the different form of pneumocystis. So the way we designed this, we looked at every patient that had a PCP PCR performed within a time frame, and we excluded anyone who had a PCR done on a sputum sample or a pleural fluid or a tissue. We wanted to focus on patients with pneumocystis PCR done on a BAL. If they were already being treated for pneumocystis, we excluded them. If they didn't have a beta-D-glucan done at the same time or more than 7 days by the time we were doing the PCR, we also excluded them. And so we were left with about 400 patients. About 53 of them had a positive PCR, and the other 300 or so had a negative PCR. So that allows us to look at how did the beta-D-glucan perform in this group of patients, the positive ones for PCR and the negative ones. So we did a few things. As I mentioned earlier, the threshold for beta-D-glucan to be positive is 80 picogram per ml. So we looked at the performance if we look at the threshold as established by the manufacturer. So here we compare definite and probable pneumocystis versus possible. And you'll see that the sensitivity of the beta-D-glucan for pneumocystis varied 87% and specificity 84%. So not super high, not super great. Positive predictive value at that cutoff, 94%, negative predictive value, 68. So a negative doesn't really necessarily tell you much. Then we looked at it, what about if we raise the cutoff, trying to make the test a little bit more specific by raising the positive from 80 to 200. So when we look at that, the sensitivity then drops because now you've raised the threshold for something to be positive, but the specificity and the positive predictive value now we're at 100%. So if I already have PCR that's positive, and I just need beta-D-glucan to help me see something that's more specific, if I'm raising it to 200 and my specificity goes to 100, that means that maybe I can use this 2 pieces of information to diagnose patient with definite or probable PCP as a better tool. So what we concluded by this study is that combining the high analytical sensitivity and specificity of PCR with the beta-D-glucan was a really good way of helping interpreting the clinical presentation of some of these patients. So the example of pneumocystis highlights a few things. One, there's no perfect test. Diagnostic or screening, it can get really complicated when you think about fungi. Because there is all of this laboratory developed tests, not very much commercial IVD assay, there's no standardization, right? Even as I'm showing what we did with pneumocystis, this is still something that's very specific to MSK and our cancer patient population. The complicated clinical gold standard that we cannot even define the infection, all of these causes really fungal infection to be quite challenging. So what are we going to do about this? This is where the Fungal Diagnostic Laboratory Consortium came. And if you're really, really interested and want to hear all about it, there was an Editor in Conversation podcast several months ago, last year, where the two, Sean and I, were able to talk a little bit more about this. The way the Fungal Diagnostic Consortium came about was really during one of the ASM Clean Micro Open. So ASM holds this conference once a year where they bring clinical laboratory director, scientists as an industry colleague, get us in a room and say, okay, what are the problems we need to solve? Talk to each other, come up with a solution. So in 2018, Sean Zhang, who is the director of the mycology laboratory at Hopkins, and I attended the Clean Micro Open. And both of us presented on the challenge in fungal diagnostic. So after the conference, him and I were talking, saying, you know what, we met, I mean, we didn't meet there, but we had the same idea. What do we do? How do we solve this problem so that we can have better tools? That's where that initial discussion started. That same year at ID Week, Sean Zhang and Sean Lockhart. So you can only imagine being in a meeting with these two guys because it's like Sean. It's I have to say Sean L and Sean Z. But the two Sean were also in a meeting with each other during ID Week. And they talked about the same thing. They're like, it's very challenging to diagnose fungi and we're still relying heavily on culture. What can we do? So we got on a call, the three of us, and discussed that, one of the things we can do is just like maybe there is strength in collaborating with everybody else that feels the same way. So we discussed the creation of the Fungal Diagnostic Laboratory Consortium. And we had several different names, but the FDLC just sort of rolled out really quickly. So that's what we settled on and invited many of our colleagues to basically start working together with the goal is really to combine all of the effort that each of the individual laboratory in the US is trying to do in terms of like coming up with better diagnostic for fungi, and then talk with our industry partner, encouraging them to really invest into diagnosing, creating tools for fungal diagnostics. Some of the really specific things was like creating a fungal diagnostic repository, doing clinical studies, and so on. So collaborating across the different groups. Now we have a website. I have nothing to do with this, but I think it's cool. Like it's something to do with Star Wars or Star Trek, one of those two things. But we have a website hosted at Hopkins. The number of members for the FDLC has continued to increase, and here just a screenshot of some of the labs that we've been working with. It's been really fun and really cool. Right before the pandemic, right? So the year before, we had our first meeting at ASM. And so just picture of some of the members here, but it was very exciting. And the very first thing that we did, we came up with a review of what the gaps in the laboratory diagnosis of infection were, right? So all of the members here really sat together and say, okay, what do we need to prioritize? What are the problems that we are trying to fix? And we wrote this article for ASM, and we identify 5 big priority groups, many of them related to developing new diagnostic for mucor, for pneumocystis, but also things like educating people, because at this point, we still rely a lot on culture, so we should be able to recognize mucor from Aspergillus. So what have we been doing? We've created a few working groups. We have a mold identification by MoldyTough. So I mentioned that we use the Vitec instrument with one of the 2 vendors for moldy, and it has really good database for mold, but the other is still really like a lab developed process. So how can we enrich the database so that moldy diagnosis is much better? Doing fungal identification from FFPE tissue. So sometimes patients get in a biopsy and they get fixed in paraffin, sent to, they sent to the AP, the anatomic pathology part of the lab, get fixed, and then we don't have any tissue in the lab to even grow them in culture. How can we develop better tool, not just for identifying the mold, but also how do we report this in a way that's standardized? And then pneumocystis pneumonia, it's actually a study that's ongoing right now that is funded by Diasorin. So we were able to get some of our industry colleagues to actually invest in the FDLC. Last November, we had our very first course in clinical fungi. Look at that group of smiling people that spent 5 days just staring at a computer and mold and under microscope, just of fungi. And this course was organized by Amanda Harrington at Loyola and Sean Zhang. Super successful, many sponsors. And then lastly, on June 18, we'll have I talked a little bit about how we could spend the whole day. I can see your very excited faces, but how we could spend a whole day just talking about fungi. Well, we're going to do half a day at ASM. We have a fungal session where we'll have 3 different topics covering all of this. So I'm going to summarize here. Immunocompromised patient, cancer patient, asthma, diabetes. Those are some of the big groups that are at increased risk of fungal infection. Because we don't have the best tool, we tend to have delay in diagnosis, worse outcome, and high healthcare costs. Mentioned the billions of dollars. Only a few diagnostic tests available, and hopefully with the Fungal Diagnostic Consortium, our goal is really to help fill those gaps by really shining light on this challenge and encouraging our colleagues, both in other clinical lab and industry, to really invest in this particular area of clinical micro. And I stop here and I'll be happy to answer any question. Thank you.
For Dr. Bobby. I have a microphone, so I'm gonna take the opportunity to start. So, you mentioned some of the shortcomings of the biomarker type testing, but they're really attractive on the clinical side for monitoring these chronically immunosuppressed patients because they're relatively non-invasive and, you know, they're pretty convenient. And then you mentioned that the European groups are far ahead of us, I think, in the diagnostic realm, and they've sort of started replacing some of those things with maybe targeted PCRs, maybe and in some cases panels for like mucorales, which really don't work well with the biomarkers after dose. My question though is, given their variable performance and the fact that none of those tests really have been proven to positively impact patient care, are we wasting our time trying to put together these really complex molecular panels where we should be spending our effort on like totally new technologies that are different than what we've seen before?
No, that's a very good question. And I think the answer is both. Part of the reason we are not able to say that they necessarily impact clinical outcome is because a PCR is not equal to another PCR is not equal to another PCR, right? So I mentioned how one of the challenges is no standardization. So developing, as we all each develop our assays, the sensitivity, the specificity for whatever particular patient population and clinical sample varies so much that it's very hard to say that it doesn't have an impact. I can tell you at Sloan, we are heavily invested in developing those. But at the same time, we also send them out, and our clinicians rely on them. They're like, I need to just have this additional piece of information. Right now, as I mentioned for pneumocystis, there isn't like one test. It's like, okay, I'm going to submit for culture and I'm going to do PCR. Novel methodology for sure, right? I think like many of us right now, metagenomic is the big thing that everyone wants to be. So every patient now is like, okay, I've put in the kitchen sink of all of these tests. Can I get like a metagenomic assay looking for everything, right? So I think we need to invest in both, but to begin with, even the simple things like a mucor panel, an aspergillus panel, we need to develop this, but also standardize them. So we don't have 10 different assays out there that we cannot make sense of how they compare to each other. And that's part of the FDLC trying to say, how can we standardize the things that we're doing?
That's the question on the chat.
Why haven't we seen standardization of these panels? We have BioFire everything, we have Reflex, we have all of these panels. What is the limiting factor for diagnostic companies to invest in a panel like this, bring it through the FDA? They have to spend money. Like, why are they not spending the money to do those things?
Because it's like I was mentioning, it's considered like a neglected, a rare disease. Not neglected means that no one cares. But from an industry standpoint, they want to invest in things that they are going to make a buck out of, right? Like, so when you think about the immunocompromised patient population, it is increasing, but it's still not like such a high number of people that it's economically a viable option. So that's been sort of the feedback that we get, that well, how many patients have aspergillus? Well, we show the prevalence, but if you look at cardiac disease, that's probably like 10 times way more than that, right? So I think it's been from that standpoint. Companies like DiaSorin, for example, right now, when they work with us, they want to invest, but they're like, you know, they have to make a case to their money people that, yeah, it's not just interest, it's that there's actually need for it. But the number of patients that those are significant infection, but the number of patients tends to be relatively small compared to other diseases. So that's where we always get the limitation.
Okay. Yeah, they need to see our send out volume to justify their case to something. Cindy put in the chat a question: what is the MSK protocol for Canada horse patient screening? What is screening coming on?
Yeah. So Candida auris. So at Sloan, that's actually, like you have tests in the lab that the techs love or don't mind, and then you have the ones that they hate. So Candida auris is one of the tests that my techs absolutely hate, just because it's so involved, right? A lot of fungal tests, unlike bacterial or even viruses, you have to do like this pre-processing. So there's a lot of sort of manipulation prior to even doing the extraction and the PCR. So we do a lab developed PCR for for Candida auris. And every patient that comes into the ICU, so it's very specific to the ICU, the screening, we don't screen the whole hospital, we screen the ICU on admission, a few days in during the stay, and on exit from the ICU. And so we do over 600 Candida auris per month. The good thing is that we don't really see much of it. So 99% of them are negative, which I think is part of the frustration. Like, at least if you were recovering a lot of it, it would make it, but I think it's really a organisms that tend to be more prevalent in long-term care facility. And many of our patients don't necessarily come from there. So that's part of the reason I think we don't see it. But we've been one of the labs since pre-COVID that's been doing the screening in New York. And yeah, that's how we do it. We don't see a lot of, there's no FDA approved test, but I know that at least one company is trying to get that done.
Thank you. I know diagnostics, the multiple PCR diagnostics and DL is one thing. Wondering about the challenges in, for example, like blood culture for your pediatric patients, or like CSF, or heart valve tissue, or like far samples to get how these like PCR tests are doing with that, and if they're quantitative or quantitative.
Yeah, see, I didn't even touch that. That's like the other part of things, like the quantitative versus qualitative. Because when you think about, I go back to pneumocystis, but anything really with PCR, you sort of have information that gives you some level of quantitation, but there's no standardization. There's no way to really necessarily interpret that. I think everyone now is like CT value obsessed. So even with any PCR that we do that's qualitative, eventually someone's going to ask for a CT value. In sample like BAL, that's even more complicated, right? Because again, a BAL is not a BAL. You take a fluid, you put in someone's lung and you pull something back. The amount that you get out of the lungs varies by patient, and you can do the same thing on the same patient and get different volumes. So not really standardized per se. Your question was also about pediatric.
Yeah, so like the pediatric blood culture, blood cultures with a lot of volume.
Yeah.
CSF resource that physicians want to access onto.
Yeah. 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 One of the good things, being at a cancer hospital, I don't have a huge pediatric patient population, thankfully. But the volume is always an issue, even with like the adult, where you had a few mils of CSF and you want to do every possible test under the sun, that becomes challenging, right? Because it's not just fungal, it's viral and it's bacterial. We have fungal culture that we do. I have to look at that data again because I don't think that we never really recover anything. I think there was a discussion recently about what's the point of a fungal culture. With the pediatric, even the blood culture, we do PIT blood culture, smaller volume. We recover the candida. So in that sense, it's working. Is it the best? I'm not sure that it is, because again, it's sort of like whatever you put in, that's what you get out. So if you have small volume, you're definitely limited by the recovery rate there.
We'll finish with two quick ones that looks like from the chat. So Dieter asks, you mentioned some more tests in Europe. Any contact with European sciences about the quality of those tests?
Yeah, no, and one of the things we've done as part of the FDLC is work or at least have a conversation with EPAASM, which is like the International Society for something, I forget the whole thing, but it's some of our European colleagues. And EPAASM is very similar in the sense that they also have different work groups. So they have done some studies in some of these assays, and there is a wide range still of challenges there. Things like the asparagus PCR, I think a few years back they did an asparagus PCR study. A big challenge with asparagus is like even in empty EDTH, you will have asparagus DNA. So when you're collecting that and you're trying to diagnose a patient, like the tube itself is contaminated with asparagus DNA. So those are some of the studies that they've done so that it sort of informs us of what some of the limitation and the background that we need to be looking into in terms of how to interpret some of these tests. I haven't seen anything from a quantitative standpoint. The most recent guideline on even how you define infection included some of these PCR, like the asparagus PCR, but it had to be from like the tissue where you see asparagus. It wasn't like a blood sample. So we still have a long way to go, even with areas where there are some of these commercial tests available. Was that the question?
Looks like a question about, you showed two cases where there were some discrepancies in the diagnostic results and you have to sort them out. How often what percentage do you see this sort of discrepancy analysis?
Yeah. So now that we ditched the DFA, we don't see the discrepancy anymore. So that's solved that problem. But the discrepancy that we see, and part of the reason we did the study with Dr. Mojaya, is that we have beta-D-glucan and we have PCP PCR. So much so that now, I mean, it's not a discrepancy, but it was more like PCP PCR is positive, the beta-D-glucan is negative. Are we interpreting this discrepancy as this is colonization? It's not really a actively replicating pneumocystis. We can't really tell. But what we have basically come down to with a lot of ID colleagues is that we look at both of these results in order to make a call. So if the pneumocystis PCR is positive and the beta-D-glucan is 500 and above, for sure, we say that this is pneumocystis. But because some of these patients are on prophylaxis for pneumocystis, it has to be the right patient population to make this type of call. So if a patient is on prophylaxis and they have pneumocystis, PCR positive, beta-D-glucan negative, the interpretation will be that's probably nothing, it's not colonization. So we use a lot of the information that we gleaned from that study in order to make cases when things don't align necessarily.
Great. I realize I only get the confusing cases, but I would have said 100% of the cases have confusing results. Fungal testing are challenging.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for coming.
Yes, I mean that probably is the case. You know, with pediatric patient and neonates, I think you have that limitation that she was pointing out, but also you think about sort of when the patient population that would have fungal infection, probably not the neonate, like that would be like. Candida, like which one, right? Because it is like in one.
Species
Candida.
before,
Yeah. So Candida in the blood.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that can happen. But the thing is that Candida should grow in any blood culture. So that's not a limitation, right? Like if they're doing a blood culture and patient has Candida, it would grow during the 5 days that we incubate that. So it's not that. It's more if you don't even test for it, then you may not pick it up because you're prioritizing something. But Candida